All right. Good morning, Tommy. Glad you joined us. Good morning, everyone else. Hi, Scott. Thanks for joining us from Hampton. I hope I said that correctly. I appreciate you being here. All right. Well, we're just after 11. So for those of you still joining in, feel free to use the chat, not only to introduce yourself, please do that first, but also as we go, feel free to ask questions in the chat. And then once we wrap up at the end, we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. Feel free to make comments or, share your take on things. We want your participation and that interaction via that chat feature. So, but today I'm so excited about SGR's Wednesday webinar because we have Steve Scaffidi here, who is the former mayor of Oak Creek and has a story to tell certainly about visionary leadership and the development of their Drexel Town Square. So I'm not gonna share too many spoiler alerts. I'll just go ahead and turn it over to you, Steve.
Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I don't need a big introduction. I talk for a living nowadays. I host a radio show, which I'll get to in a second. I was a mayor from 2012 to 2017. I've got about 10 years of elected official experience. I'll give you a quick overview of my story. And I started in Milwaukee. I went to the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I was recruited by the Nielsen Company. Those of you who are familiar, I think they've changed their names a few times, but I think Nielsen's still in it. They gather television ratings, and I was recruited to do some of the early people meter work, which is basically the age when we moved from the diaries that people filled out to tell people what to find out what they watched to actual computer systems, and eventually turned into software as TV morphed from just TV to laptops and PCs, and of course eventually our smartphones. I did that for 28 years. I retired in 2012. I think it was May of 2012. And I thought about what I was going to do next. And I had an opportunity. Somebody asked me, do you ever think about running for mayor? And I had been an elected official. I was an alderperson, common council president for a while. And I thought about it, and I was always frustrated. And maybe some of the leaders that are on the call share this, but I was frustrated by the view of our city, which is Oak Creek, which is just south of the airport in Milwaukee County, just south of downtown Milwaukee, about 11 miles or so. And I was frustrated by how our city was viewed and where it was going. There was a kind of a lack of direction. It was very much a war between we like it the way it is, which at the time I think was in the mid 20s as far as population, and then with an incredible number of resources, land, and opportunities available, what it could be, which now I think is in the 37,000 range. So I was excited about that opportunity. I ran in 2012, won the primary, won the general election in April, and the weird part of my story, and I've spoken around the country about this, and this certainly shaped my leadership as far as how I look at things, how I solve problems, hopefully, and how I react to things. We had a mass shooting in August of 2012, August 5th, 2012. Some of you might remember the Sikh temple shooting. Uh, it made the news. It was an attack on a place of worship. I wasn't that familiar with the Sikh population in August of 2012, but I certainly am now. If you don't know, it's the fifth largest religion in the world, faith group, tremendously compassionate people. They were attacked in their place of worship. 6 people killed that day. One later died from his injuries years later. And I was tasked with figuring that out. One, we certainly had law enforcement, public safety folks who dealt with that part of it, but sort of figuring out the community piece of it from a response, how we get better, how we react to these things. And I was just talking about this with my old communications director at Oak Creek, Leslie, and I said, do you remember when we put on our social media, and we had just created that social media, thankfully, that city profile, probably a few months before the shooting. And basically the message for me was, we will not let this tragic event define us, i.e. not define our future. And we used that as a sort of a banner or a mantra to say, you know what, this is not our story. So we did a couple interesting things. We worked closely with a lot of different organizations, locally and nationally, to shape the messaging after. We even hired a local PR company, Miller Communications in Milwaukee, well known. They do everything from politics to crisis management, all that stuff. I know Carl Miller very well. He was on my show recently. And we crafted a message that said, we can do so much better and we can react in the right way. Now Oak Creek's looked upon as a leader in response to mass shootings. Matter of fact, the Department of Justice has cited us numerous times for the way we did it. And basically, the overriding message was we are going to communicate effectively with those impacted. We are going to not let this, as I said, define us. And that was the starting point for really all of this stuff. And obviously, the big development story, Creek, and I know a lot of you who are watching and listening are sort of interested in that. When I came into office in 2012, Drexel Town Square didn't really exist. It was an idea, one that to be completely honest, I wasn't sure I was supportive of, to say we have an empty slate. Go backward a little bit. I was a Common Council president. We decided to take down an old AC Delco plant known for things like catalytic converters. They did some electronic work, and they actually worked for the space shuttle program to the point where when they had the Challenger explosion, they were actually shut down for a while to try to figure out what happened there. That plant was closed, and I won't give you the long story, but the short story is we exchanged recycling rights for having that building take down. So we have this blank slate, and I keep saying the number wrong. It's something like 83 acres or in that ballpark, 80 acres. As you know, age and time sometimes diffuse your memory on the specifics, but it's around that. And we said, what do we want to do with this? And we launched a years long sort of public involved look at how we re-engineer, redesign a downtown that we never really had. Oak Creek had a sort of main street. It was Howell Avenue, which is, if you know Wisconsin, State Highway 38, runs north-south from the airports and north to some real rural areas south of Oak Creek where people still farm. Matter of fact, one of the largest sauerkraut producers is just south of us, about 10 miles. And we didn't have a downtown. So we got together. Now, I just did a webinar not too long ago. People ask me, well, you say you got together. How'd you do that? Public input was a big part of this, trying to see what the public wanted. So we had a sort of a city hall complex that was probably about a mile away from where we are now at Drexel Town Square. Very old buildings, 50 plus years. Matter of fact, the joke that we always had when we were running our common council meetings was there was a steady drip of water from the ceiling in the common council chambers, almost exactly where the public came up to speak at the podium, and it was kind of a running joke. That was the sort of the state of repair or state of conditions of our buildings, and we had to do something. The big debate was, what do we do? Do we stay, remodel, redo there, or do we do this grand design? We went with the grand design. A couple of things I benefited from. One was that story itself, that we needed to do something. So urgency was there. How we decided to do it was benefited by the fact that I had a common council who they weren't always in agreement, but when it came to making hard decisions, and those are hard decisions because we're spending millions of dollars. Quick background on Oak Creek, we host a power plant. City of Oak Creek gets funds from that power plant annually, and that sort of makes life easier because we all know how it is to manage city budgets or community budgets now. That made that story a little bit easier. Obviously, tax incremental financing is a part of that, diffusing some of that impact over time. Those have worked out very well for Oak Creek. I haven't been specific about the numbers involved generally because I don't know, as I'm not in the city anymore, what those final numbers look at as far as the build out of Drexel Town Square. But it includes everything from city, retail, restaurants. It's now skirted by private business. A company called Zund just built a beautiful building right behind City Hall, north of City Hall, I should say, south of City Hall. So yeah, I've already lost some of my recall about where the stuff is. And we laid out this streetscape of what this could be. And I would say probably most of the time over the next 2 or 3 years in the sort of concept phase, as we entertain design options, as we talked about specifics, we talked about budget, we talked about what we wanted to include in it. We almost always had consensus from the council. Our city government is maybe unique. 6 council members, 6 alder people, and I think the time was all alder men, which is not the case now. They have the votes. Mayor only votes in case of a tie. I know some cities do it differently, but I think in the course of my tenure in the 5 years, I think I voted 3 times. And I'm not sure that any of them involve Drexel Town Square. So basically, that's the ultimate in leadership, right? Convincing the people who do vote and who represent your citizenry, this is a good idea. Famous story about all of this is when we first had the presentation about the concept of moving the city presence, city hall, library, to this site, Drexel Town Square. I voted no. I wasn't convinced. I was a fan of moving the library, but I wasn't sure that the city hall made sense. People forget that. They give you credit for things that maybe you don't deserve credit for. If I'm responsible for anything, it's for being a good communicator and sort of moving the process along so that I could get the buy-in from the council, involving the public to the degree where we had massive meetings where we brought in some of the designs and said, what do you think? Like, does this make sense here? And that part of it sort of convinces the public that you're trying to do the right thing. None of this is easy. Anybody who leads a community knows this. Spending 20 or 30 million dollars to move something that already exists in whatever fashion it exists is not always popular. And I can tell you, not everybody's a fan. There are people, and I do a radio show, so you can imagine in the world of the political world we live in now, there's always going to be people who don't like you. There are still people to this day that cannot stand me based on some of these decisions we made back then. How would I describe Drexel Town Square? Somebody asked me this at an engagement I did recently. It's unique in that it has all of these pieces. And I don't know if I mentioned the housing part. One of the cool stories of Drexel Town Square is I had the opportunity to go visit. His name is Rick Barrett. He's a developer in Milwaukee. He's currently building, I think, the either the third or fourth tallest building downtown in Milwaukee. And I thought to myself, along with our one of our aldermen, let's go visit him and see what he has to say about doing something he's never done before, which is investing and building in not in a downtown big city, but in a suburban city. And we're, as I said, about 11 miles from downtown, 10 or 11 miles. And we went to tour one of his buildings. It was the Modern, which is, if you know Milwaukee at all, it's about a block from the Fiserv Forum where the Milwaukee Bucks play and they have concerts. And from the bottom floor, the basement actually, all the way to the top floor, which wasn't even finished yet, we convinced Rick to come at least to listen to an idea to do residential differently in a suburban environment in the context of a high density suburban downtown development. And I'm obviously simplifying it, but over the course of the next few years, we were able to make that work. And now I believe Rick, with current city leaders, is in his third or fourth phase of that residential piece, which sort of skirts the outside areas of Drexel Town Square. What's unique about Drexel Town Square? This was also one of those big buy-in for the public. We did not want to create a stormwater problem. So every bit of rainwater, stormwater that falls on Drexel Town Square goes through. Somebody smarter than me will be able to give you a better name, but these permeable pavers or whatever they're called. Water falls through the pavement, sort of naturally processed, and goes into a wetland park that takes all of that stormwater. And it's called I call it Dale Richards Park. That's a former mayor, but it's got another name, Emerald Park. But it's certainly a unique way of handling that part of it. Another cool piece of this is adjacent property to the Drexel Town Square development and the Wetlands Park was owned by Woodman's, which is a large grocery store chain, immediately southeast of Drexel Town Square. They, of course, as most businesses do, had to have a stormwater pond as part of their development. Any new development always has that, right? Well, we made him a pitch that said, here's what we can do. We'll take that stormwater pond and your stormwater from your property, which is probably a few acres. We'll move that into the wetlands area. You can then sell your property. And I think the eventual sale price was over $1 million. We netted them that profit on land they never would have been able to use. Obviously, they had to process their stormwater, rainwater somewhere. And to this day, every time I see Phil Woodman, I point that out to him. It's like that was a win for both sides on that. We got to do what we needed to do, and they certainly were able to capitalize on that. And that is now the home of the company I talked about before, which is Zune. I want to talk briefly before we entertain questions about issues. One, management of meetings is really critical and important in all of this. As I said, I had a pro-development, pro-Drexel Town Square council. But as anybody knows who leads, there's also critical voices that are going to take issue. My sort of my MO, and maybe that's carried through from my days with Nielsen when I was sort of a conflict resolution guy dealing with angry TV stations about ratings and all that stuff, to my time as mayor, to my time as a radio host who used to have 3 hours, now I just have an hour on politics. Understanding and listening, very important. Processing what they are asking or complaining about, and then finding a resolution that doesn't wind up being yelling at each other. Now, it doesn't mean I'm perfect. There are meetings where you walk away, and I did, very frustrated. And there are people to this day that will not speak to me because of this development. I would put those people in the camp of they like the old Oak Creek, which when I grew up here in high school, I moved here when I was a sophomore in high school, it had about 13,000 people, still a big farm community. That wasn't going to be a reality. The reality for Oak Creek is it's adjacent to the airport. It has probably as much available development land as anybody around here. It has a freeway connection, so much so that we built another one of those leadership steps that you have to take. This was before I was mayor. I was common council president then. We decided to build an interchange, which is not an easy process. It was the first one in Milwaukee County, I think, in 40 years. Take or leave 5 years. Significant city investment, state investment. I think it was about a 50-50 co-share of that bill, which was millions of dollars, upwards of 10. But that development before Drexel Town Square made it possible for Drexel Town Square to happen, and eventually led to another big development project, which I've been kind of associated with, which is IKEA. And we were proud of being the first community in Wisconsin to host an IKEA store, which is still there and doing very well. Quick IKEA story, because I always like to share the fun stuff. I walked into a meeting in the old city hall, right close to that leak I was talking about earlier, and I was told that it was a meeting I would like. That's my old development director, who's also our PIO at the time, Doug Seymour, said, "You're gonna like this meeting." And I walk into this meeting right after lunch, and there's 3 people wearing IKEA shirts, and I quickly realized this was going to be a great meeting. And the cool part of this story is, for about a year and a half, 2 years, 5 people in total on our side, city side, knew about this development. We didn't call it IKEA. We called it Project Badger State, obviously, the Wisconsin. And it didn't leak until about 3 days before the actual unveil at a public press conference, which we had a lot of fun with when the IKEA folks joined us. But we kept it secret all the time. So being good communicators is also being able to keep a secret. My wife knew, I knew, Doug knew, our city attorneys knew, and common council president knew, and that was it for a long time. Eventually, we had to roll in the rest of the council and some other folks because there's obviously a lot of planning that goes on. But that was the key to that project, was keeping it under tight reins. We didn't get everything we want, but we had a great sort of score for the city, because there's a lot of cities that wanted it, including some very cool areas west of Milwaukee, Waukesha County, famous Waukesha County for politics and business. North areas like Mequon, which is probably 10 miles north of downtown, maybe a little less. So I guess my lesson in leadership is this: listen carefully. Always pay. I'll say this here, and I'll say it whenever anyone asks me. Pay attention more closely to the people that disagree with you, because they will allow you to find the answer sometimes before you do, because they've sorted through the things they don't like. And that problem solving, that ability to understand what's going on, the dynamic of the community, is sometimes the hardest piece. Again, I benefited from a lot of things. Real quick on my radio career, the reason I do radio now is because of the things that happened in Oak Creek. It's as simple as that. I never applied for the job. I did some broadcasting in college in the early 80s in Milwaukee, University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. Never was interested in that. But I had enough connections and expertise in a couple different things. Obviously, the mass shooting contributed to a public profile, but the development piece was really the big one. And as far as being a leader in Wisconsin, that piece allowed me to do what I do now. And I host a show 9 to 10. You can find it at WTMJ.com if you're interested. Used to do 3 hours on everything I have condensed it to an hour. I do all the podcasts on politics on our station as well. That's a whole different kind of leadership, which we won't get into today. But it's sort of the I described it the other day as I was an MC of an event, fundraising event at a hospital west of Milwaukee, and I described it as the best end of your work life job you could have because at least for the 3 hour show, I literally could show up and talk about whatever I want to talk about. Now it's more focused. Obviously, we have a presidential election this year and all of that, so it's more focused. I probably only talk about 35 minutes in the hour because our commercials are sold out. But it's a great way to sort of use some of my leadership skills in a different fashion. And I told my boss and owner of the company of this the other day, Craig Karmazin, I love coming to work. My show's at 9 to 10. I show up at 6 because I'm excited to be there, and I love talking to the news people. And we're sort of an all news station. But that's another thing, even though you're an hour a day broadcast radio host, you still have to demonstrate leadership skills, and that shows up every day in how you approach things, how you look at things like politics or development or whatever issue is on your plate for that day. It's it's that leadership skill that you one develop over time because it's rare that somebody's a great leader from the beginning, and two, experience shapes that. And just a last bit here, my parents were amazing, and everybody says that about their parents for the most part. My dad was a meteorologist for 30 plus years. He retired early at 55. He's 88 now. He's still doing well, still traveling around. But he always said, and this is sort of a paraphrase of a longer version, it shouldn't be hard to do the right thing. And that's a message that I carry with me every day, and it's one that I care about. And for me, Drexel Town Square, the IKEA development, leadership in Oak Creek, we did the right thing. And again, not everybody's going to agree with that. There's going to be people that disagree, but I enjoyed that experience and the fact that we got to, I'll say it, on the sad side, the negative side, the shooting, and on the positive side, some of the most incredible development we've ever seen in Wisconsin, and with an eventual Drexel Town Square that could be worth what, $500 million at some point. That's pretty cool because it continues to develop, not just the area inside, which I think there's only one lot left, but the areas adjacent. We're seeing development there as well, including on the interchange. So that process, that story only gets better and better over time. All right, I've talked enough. I'd love to have questions, or if I can comment on something, happy to entertain those.
Awesome. So thank you so much for sharing. And if you all didn't click the pictures in the chat, I would encourage you to do so that you see some of what Steve is talking about. It's really just an incredible development. And while we're waiting on people to kind of chime in with their comments and questions, I'd like to ask, oh wait, Tommy said, thank you for the discussion today and for sharing some of the successes of this development. Can you describe one of the toughest barriers your team faced while trying to show your vision of what could be to a group of citizens/leaders who couldn't quite see it as clearly as you could? It was such a
The easy one was
question.
people like old stuff, right? I like old stuff. I just was in Europe a few times last year, and I like touching the old stuff. I like to seeing things that last. But when you have buildings, especially with the way technology's kind of crept into how we do all of our jobs now, have a building that's 50 years old that has no technology. Our basement at the old city hall was filled with paper documents. Here's an example of leadership. Before this became popular, not me, others, and I signed on to it, we're going to digitalize all these documents and records. We had interns that were really smart kids from some of the best schools in Wisconsin. We had staff working on this. We digitized all our records, which meant we didn't have to move all those records to the new place. And I'm talking a basement full of records in the 60 plus years of the city's history. Simple stuff like that. Other things that I think are really important, and the challenge that people always face is traffic. You're bringing all this traffic to the city. Well, unless you have a plan to move the traffic, this stuff is impossible to do. So we were working with the Department of Transportation of the state of Wisconsin. We work with the local folks and our city engineers. How can we make this easier? Maybe it's a right turn lane. Maybe it's shifting something. We work with the county because the county owns some of the big thoroughfares throughout the city, county of Milwaukee, through the city of Oak Creek. Can we redevelop this? All this stuff takes time. So if you don't have that sort of that mindset at the beginning that there's going to be a lot of pieces here, you're going to struggle with those challenges. Those are some of the biggest ones. It's just getting the people moved around. And that's still one, all these years later, not all these years later, but these years later, that people say, God, the traffic. That's an ongoing process. How can we make the traffic lights work better? Right? Because often that's a simple process. It doesn't have to be complicated. Somebody picks up a phone. Something's not right. The timing's not right. Something's not working here. You need a signal here or a warning light here. That's an ongoing process. Ongoing communication just as important as the initial communication. I just lost your voice. I just lost your voice
Well,
there.
sorry about that.
Oh,
That's
there, you
because
got it back. Got it back.
I'd struggle with that mute button here and there, you know. But yeah, that's a great point. It really reminded me, I was working with a city government organization and they were talking about a development and there was some pushback from the community on it being historical. It did not have a historical designation, but that it had been there for a long time and they didn't want to do any new development there because there was history there. And, my point in that was, well, if nobody's coming to see it, like if you have something historical you want people to see, you have to attract them to see it. And so I'm sure your visitation has just skyrocketed with Drexel
Yeah,
Town
I
Square.
mean, I talk to people all the time who don't live in Oak Creek, and they tell me, "Oh my God, we love Drexel Town Square. We love coming down." And I shared some of that in the pictures. There's a splash pad. There's restaurants. There's obviously some retail places you can go to. It's we talked about challenges a little bit. One of the things we did is okay. So people say he's all development. Scaffidi's pro development. But while I was there and with a really accepting council, we added more green space than any other community. We built that into the wetlands park that I talked about at the beginning. We decided, okay, if that's your thing, we're going to meet that challenge and make that part of the development. And the wetlands park has trails through it now. You can run through it. It has cool bridges. It has wetlands areas, including some really innovative ways to treat the water even after it gets there. Wildlife is returned. This is on a basically what was a parking lot and a building site for like 40 years. You would walk into that wetlands park now and not realize that was the reality for that piece of land. So that's another one of those things that you have to meet head on before that becomes a big issue. And the last piece about Oak Creek is you probably don't know this. Our lakefronts for many years was the dumping ground for Milwaukee. There was nothing in Oak Creek. It was farms and empty land. They would dump stuff on our lakefront. Companies polluted it. Well, because of a lot of hard work by some really smart people, we got those companies to clean it up whenever possible. And that land now has been transformed into residential, more green space, a huge number of acres. And it continues to be added onto as we settle some of these disputes. And it's going to be basically now a connection to the lake that we've lived on all these years, but we didn't have great access to because it was fenced off. Private industry closed that off. It's now open again.
Wow, that's awesome. Steve, also Scott asked, were there environmental challenges to the site?
Not as bad as you would think. The biggest challenge was, and anybody who's worked with big industrial plants or manufacturing plants might know this, because of the work they did, the bases and supports for this building, it had to be, somebody told me the scientific reason for this, but they needed to not move with the sensitive work they were doing for the aerospace program. So the bases on these concrete pillars are like the size of trucks. Those were buried in the ground. And as we're excavating this area to kind of transform it, they come upon these massive stone, they look like ancient monuments. They're just astronomically big. They had to decide where they had to move them, or if they had to move them. In some cases, they didn't have to. That was the biggest challenge. The other stuff was pretty minor. It's the stuff that you would see whenever you're taking a parking lot and making something else out of it. There's just some things that were there that shouldn't be there. The cleanup wasn't bad. The expense wasn't bad. Nothing compared to what we're trying to do on the lakefront, which runs into tens of millions of dollars. Thankfully, the companies that polluted it and other organizations, including the federal government, are kind of helping that. But Drexel Town Square, not too bad.
Wow. Well, where do you see it going from here?
Oak Creek is still, when I left, they were the third fastest growing city in Wisconsin. And it's for a variety of reasons. One is the downtown, but two, the story. I often, when I'm talking about the shooting, and I still do that as I travel around the country when people ask me to talk about it, the response and the acceptance that this wasn't going to be our story actually led for more diversity coming into the city. So we see a huge Hispanic population or Middle Eastern population, Muslim population, Indian, South Asian. It's all kind of transformed the city. They have a cafe day now where they invite all the different cultures, and it's become one of the biggest city celebrations we have, even sometimes beyond like our 4th of July celebration. That's sort of the success story. So that's the future for Oak Creek, is to celebrate those things that some cities find challenging or problematic. Doesn't mean it's easy. There's still all the strife out there in the world, and certainly politics lends itself to that, some of that stuff. But if you face it head on, I mean, I talked about diversity the moment the shooting happened, that I needed to be better at recognizing different people because I didn't know the six at the time, didn't know what they were about. I learned over that time because I sat every day with them for like 3 weeks. We sat in a room, members of the SIG community, FBI, Department of Justice, state leaders, local leaders, law enforcement, and we just talked through things. And the amazing thing about the six, and I said this to them many times, um, I don't know that I would have been as calm and as compassionate as they were if my family members were, as I know, because I know Kamal Saini very well. His mom was shot in the back of the head while she was praying in the temple. I don't know that I could be that person, but that's what they are. So it's a foundational understanding that this little story in Oak Creek could be something much bigger in a country and a world where we now struggle with this stuff in a big way. We all know this is it's the reality we live in. But this is an example, hopefully, and one of the reasons I think Oak Creek will be successful. There are ways to figure this stuff out. Small scale, hopefully that transcends our city and our state and gets beyond that. That's the cool part for me. That's what I take the most pride in.
That is incredible. Yeah, it sounds like you found a way to kind of take that tribalism, so to speak, and break that apart to make it your community. And I think that's incredible. What a
Yeah,
great
I had such a
story.
fun time being mayor. I mean, we had a lot going on, but it was a fun time to have that job.
Absolutely. Well, and it sounds like you were a huge part of some of that vision and then the action that followed the vision. So I'm sure it was fun for everyone in that city government during that
Yeah,
time, including
I
you.
take very little credit because I always say great leaders have great people working for them, or working with them, I should say. And I certainly did. Common Council President Ken Gale was amazing. I talked about Doug Seymour, our Planning Development Director, Engineering. Our City Attorney Larry Haskin was fantastic and still is. He's still active in his private business, but also on a part-time basis with the city. He is one person, obviously an attorney, who has led the cause on the lakefront that I was talking about before. He has single-handedly led that mission. I often say we should name it after him, but having statues built or naming things after you can sometimes be a recipe for not being liked even more. So
That's
all of us are cautious about that.
yeah, that's like I remember Ron saying, you know you're doing well when the community doesn't know your name. They
Yeah,
don't even know you exist.
smooth
That means
sailing, calm.
everything's going well,
Yeah, that's
which
something
is
of the best
fantastic.
news you can have.
Well, I certainly appreciate your time. I'm going to ask one more time, call for questions or comments. Feel free to share your thoughts. Linda said, thank you, very informative. Thank you for that feedback, Linda. I also agree with you. I think this is such a neat story, and it's certainly inspiring and encouraging. And I think it's good for all of us to remember to think about, the future and what things could be, and then how do we get there? So I think your story is a really good example of that.
I always tell people when I'm talking anywhere, I love individual communication and conversation. If you want to get a hold of me, easy. OC Oak Creek. My last name Scaffidi, Scaffidi at gmail.com. Send me an email. I'll respond. We can continue the conversation somewhere else.
Excellent. That's always appreciated as well. Well, I will put the link for next week's webinar in the chat because we hope that you will join us again. And I'll let everybody get back to oh, Glenda said, thank you. I enjoyed your point about traffic. Always a pain point. Isn't that the truth? Yeah,
Absolutely.
especially if you're growing, but growth is a good thing. Oh, let me put this in the right chat. Sorry. Here we go.
And a shameless self plug, you can find me at WTMJ.com. I host the Political Power Hour 9 to 10, Monday through Friday on WTMJ.
Perfect.
And it's politics without the yelling. I'll add that.
Hey, that's original right there. I'm also
Right.
putting a link to Steve's book that he authored. I'm putting that in the chat as well. I had put a few things in the chat, but I accidentally sent it just to the hosts and panelists. So,
Appreciate that.
oh, and thank you. Lisa added your email as well. So, thanks, Tommy. I appreciate it. And thanks everyone for joining us. And I hope to see you next week. And thank you again, Steve. We really appreciate your time and sharing your wisdom with us today.
Great to talk to all of you. Thanks for your conversation.
Thank y'all. Bye.